the aliens have chosen thousands of years worth of thousands of contacts in remote areas like the desert or the high mountains to make their contacts. It doesn't seem that they're even watching the missile engineers to grab them on their way home on the remote mountain road. You know, they're stopping people like Betty and Barney Hill. They're stopping George Adamski. They're visiting people who exist more or less in ignominy, and they're making tremendous revelations to them, and then ostensibly expecting them to go out to the world and try to change things. It seems like an almost insurmountable mission for the aliens and for the contactees.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, you know, arguably the aliens could change things overnight. If they exist, of course, they could change things overnight by making the classic landing, you know, on the White House lawn or whatever. But the fact that they don't, you know, is some like a kind of a kick in the teeth from their perspective, because really you could argue quite strongly that just contacting 20 or 30 contactees, etc., and having them do it, really, yeah, 125,000 people is a lot, but it's nowhere near, you know, the literally billions who you could convince overnight if you did a massive landing all across the planet. So,
yeah.
you know, again, but I sometimes wonder if, you know, some people think that the UFO presence is a huge one, that there are, you know, millions of them coming here, etc. I sometimes wonder, you know, if they're actually, although they're obviously in advance of us, maybe they're only more than a couple of centuries ahead of us, to where perhaps there aren't that many of them coming here. And if that's the case, that perhaps they don't, you know, the imagery that they're all powerful and etc., maybe a little bit of a ruse. Perhaps they have, you know, who knows, a handful of craft which they fly here, there, and everywhere to make it look like, you know, they're all powerful. But if you imagine if there was just, you know, a couple of hundred of them coming here, and so they're kind of trying to infiltrate society, when actually if they were to land en masse, so to speak, they'd be overwhelmed because we outnumber them. Perhaps they want to try and create the image, you know, that they're all powerful and there's far more of them than us. That might not be the case. You know, they could be just like an armada that have visited us and are trying to change us from the inside, and the best way for them to do it, because they're outnumbered, is to try and stay in the shadows.
Right. That'd be like Columbus coming aboard the shore in a hovercraft. Even though he only has 3, he's slightly outnumbered, so he better just kind of scoot in and scoot out and make it look like he's everywhere up and down the coast.
Possibly make it look like he's got far more than he has.
Yeah, right. Wow, that's interesting. That's an interesting take. One of the things that I like about your book is the way you go into depth with the interviews of the contactees, at least the evidence that's available. You give us the whole story, the whole picture. And very soon in the book, you bring into the picture the idea that government did give some thought to what's going to happen to society if they make a mass approach, if they make a mass fly over Washington. What's going to happen? How are people going to react? And so evidently it appears that the CIA gets involved very early in the genre and starts doing some experiments, some playing around. Tell us about Mr. Andalucci.
Yeah, Orfeo Angelucci was one of the earliest contactees, and he had an interesting story. He, as a child, he was sort of very sickly, ill child, suffering from a lot of ill health right through his teens and 20s. And he developed an interest in like rocketry and flight and things like this. And he was fascinated by experiments with balloons, like high-altitude experiments. And he said that one particular day in the late 40s, he launched this large cluster of balloons. And he said, as he was watching it fly in the sky, this saucer-shaped object swooped in as if it was wondering what this balloon cluster was. It was almost like monitoring it. And after that, he claimed to have heard like this disembodied voice saying that, you know, some sort of extraterrestrial intelligence wanted to make contact with him. And all his contacts, he said, occurred at like a remote, very dark, isolated bridge outside of Los Angeles, where he would travel to late at night and park the car and then go under the bridge. And he actually talked about how these experiences would begin, not like the landing of a flying saucer, but he said he would see these kind of like balls of glowing light, which would almost like hypnotize him. And then the lights would transform into almost like an angelic-looking alien being, where they would have an exchange which is very similar and typical of George Adamski, like, you know, the nuclear weapons angle, living in peace and harmony, etc. Now, that was his initial set of experiences, which he wrote about in a couple of books. What was interesting, though, is that there's evidence that at least some of Angelucci's experiences, they sound very much like, I don't know if you ever heard of the early CIA project MK Ultra. MK Ultra was essentially, in simplistic terms, a mind control project. It was a project the CIA set up to use to do early investigations into things like LSD, to see if they could, you know, drug enemy agents and get secrets out of them by putting their minds into an altered state. And of course, LSD was pretty much first synthesized in 1948. So it was in the early years after this that the CIA began looking at also hypnotism, altering people's minds, and again, to see if it could be used from an espionage perspective. And Angelucci, in one of his books, talks about an experience where he met this, or claimed to have met this guy who said he'd met similar aliens to those that Angelucci had met. And they met in a restaurant, and the guy said to Angelucci, well, I can tell you about these experiences, but you have to drink this liquid. And so he gave him a glass of liquid and put this pill in it, which, you know, kind of reckless to go ahead and drink something when somebody's put a pill in a drink and then told you to drink it. But Angelucci did do this, and he said that within about 30 minutes, his mind felt kind of strange, and the room kind of took on different colors and tones, and he saw all sorts of fantastic swirling figures, and it literally did sound like an LSD experience. And to make it even more interesting, he said at 2 tables away from where he was sitting, there were 2 military guys in uniform staring intently at him, as if it was almost like some experiment that they were trying to gauge how successful it was. And the guy who said he'd had these similar UFO experiences began questioning him all about his own encounters. It was almost like they'd rendered Angelucci into like a bit of a drugged, altered state to try and get the truth out of him, using truth drugs, I guess, about his experience. And, you know, again, it sounds fantastic, but there's no doubt that the CIA were doing a lot of dabbling and digging into mind control and mind manipulation in this period. And it does sound like a classic drug trip that he was put on as a means to kind of open his mind and for the CIA to find out what he was doing and why he was doing it, and in a way where he probably afterwards wouldn't remember too much about it.
So, do you think that they were experimenting with him in the sense that they wanted to see what the drug would do, or do you think that they were trying to, because evidently they knew a little bit about him. Evidently, he reports that they spoke to him about his balloon experiment, that they've been watching him, and, you know, this is a frail guy, you know, just a pretty alone kind of guy, not the kind of guy that is a leader of people, and yet he reports this amazing experience where they are paying serious attention to him and they're involving him in an experiment. Do you think maybe that they wanted to know what level of panic society would display if they were exposed to this, or do you think there was a disinformation effort going on here?
Well, I think there's actually several things, Brooks. I do think that there have been a number of very, very credible UFO incidents, and there's no doubt if you look at the CIA's declassified files from the early 50s, they actually expressed a lot of concern as to what the nature of the UFO phenomenon was and how it could, from like a sociological perspective, affect the people. And of course, they were also looking at it, well, if it affects the people sociologically, how is it going to affect people psychologically? And from a national security perspective, are people going to be jamming the emergency lines, you know, with phone calls? And are the Russians going to take advantage, you know, if no one can get through on the emergency signals, could they launch a sneak attack, you know, behind a UFO scare?
Right.
There are all these different angles the CIA was looking at. And I think, as I sort of express in the book, the possibility that the CIA may actually have staged some UFO incidents, and to have done so not to fool people as such, but to put certain people in the place of experiencing these incidents and then seeing how they respond and react to them,